History as it happens, August 15th, 2023. Oppenheimer, new weapon, new age.
The pattern of the use of atomic weapons was set at Hiroshima. They are weapons of aggression, of surprise, and of terror. If they are ever used again, it may well be by the thousands, or perhaps by the tens of thousands. Their method of delivery may well be different, and may reflect new possibilities of interception and new efforts to outwit them. The strategy of their use may well be different than it was against an essentially defeated enemy.
Oppenheimer's story is very exciting. It's a little strange to use a word like entertainment, when it comes to something as serious as nuclear weapons, which is what the film is dealing with. But I think cinema has always had the potential to draw people into an experience.
You are the man who gave them the power to destroy themselves, and the world is not prepared.
I don't know if we can be trusted with such a weapon, but I know the Nazis can.
We are now prepared to destroy more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have in any city.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Christopher Nolan's cinematic masterpiece tells the story of a brilliant scientist, the father of the atomic bomb, of the scientific breakthroughs and ethical and political dilemmas of his age, a story of 20th century America. Who was Robert Oppenheimer, and how did his work change our world? That's next as we report History as it Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Oh, it absolutely was different. It's instead of hundreds of bombers going over a city, it was one plane, one bomb, 70,000 people dead.
3 months after Japan surrendered, ending the Second World War, Robert Oppenheimer delivered an address at the University of Pennsylvania. The father of the atomic bomb called it a weapon for aggressors. And he said the elements of surprise and of terror are as intrinsic to it as are the fissionable nuclei. The bomb had changed men's lives, said Oppenheimer, and now to prevent its use by the hundreds or thousands of bombs would require international cooperation.
As a further matter requiring international consideration, like all other matters that so require it, it is not unique, but is a vast threat and a new one to all the peoples of the earth by its novelty, its terror, its strangely Promethean quality. It has become, in the eyes of many of us, a unique opportunity.
20 years later, in 1965, on the island of St. John, where he spent much of the last years of his life, Oppenheimer gave an interview to CBS News. He was asked, looking back now, do you think our country's use of the bomb was necessary?
And the ending of the war by this means, certainly cruel, was not undertaken lightly. But I am not, as of today, confident that a better course was then open. I have not a very good answer to this question.
Dr. Oppenheimer, nevertheless, with all the rationalization, with all the inevitability of the decision that history demonstrates to us, you and many like you who brought the bomb into being still seem to suffer, may I say, from a bad conscience about it. Is that true, sir?
Well, I don't want to speak for others because we're all different. I think when you play a meaningful part in bringing about the death of over 100,000 people and the injury of a comparable number, you naturally don't think of that as with ease. I believe we had a great cause to do this, but I do not think that our consciences should be entirely easy at stepping out of the part of studying nature, learning the truth about it, to change the course of human history. Long ago, I said once that in a crude sense, which no vulgarity and no humor could quite erase, the physicists had known sin. And I didn't mean by that the deaths that were caused as the result of our work. I meant that we had known the sin of pride. We had turned to affect, in what proved to be a major way, the course of man's history. We had the pride of thinking we knew what was good for man. And I do think it has left a mark on many of those who were responsibly engaged. This is not the natural business of a scientist.
And in December the following year, just a couple months before he would die of cancer, Oppenheimer wrote an old friend, "What I have never done is to express regret for doing what I did and could at Los Alamos." And you'll find these words on page 584 of American Prometheus, the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography written by Kai Bird and the late Martin J. Sherwin. So what prompted that letter? The German playwright Heinar Kippart had written a play, In the Matter of Robert Oppenheimer, and the concluding monologue had the actor playing Oppie confessing his guilt for having built the bomb. And the real-life Oppenheimer did not appreciate that. Guilt, responsibility, regret. As Oppenheimer said to the CBS interviewer, "I have not a very good answer to this question." To contemporaries and historians alike, J. Robert Oppenheimer was and is a complicated, difficult man, capable of kindness and sincerity, arrogance and vanity. And it fell to the actor Cillian Murphy to bring the father of the A-bomb to life on the big screen in Christopher Nolan's brilliant film, Oppenheimer, courtesy Universal Pictures.
We're in a race against the Nazis. And I know what it means if the Nazis have a bomb.
They have a 12-month head start.
18.
How could you possibly know that?
We've got one hope. All America's industrial might and scientific innovation connected here. A secret laboratory. Keep everyone there until it's done.
This is the first in a 3-episode series on the historical issues raised by the film and the book upon which it was based. In this episode, we'll talk about the new scientific and military age ushered in by the bomb and its enduring impact on our lives today. There are more than 12,000 nuclear warheads in the world. And maybe this movie will help renew a faded cultural awareness that pervaded American life in the Cold War when it comes to nuclear combat. In Part 2, we'll tackle the decision to drop the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And in Part 3, we'll cover the missed opportunity to avoid a nuclear arms race in the 1950s, despite the efforts of Oppenheimer and like-minded scientists to oppose the H-bomb program. So, have you seen the movie? I've seen it twice. It's tremendous filmmaking, and it is faithful to the book. Is it entirely accurate as a work of history? Well, of course not. No movie is. Nolan uses some dramatic license, and you can and should seek out articles online that dissect these relatively minor inaccuracies, at least in my opinion. What's not in the film is also important. The Japanese, the victims of the bomb, are invisible. And it mostly ignores Oppenheimer's role, as historian Barton Bernstein puts it, in helping General Groves, played by Matt Damon, downplay in 1945 to the U.S. public and thus also to the international public the strong evidence of substantial radiation-caused injuries and deaths in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Oppenheimer was not a saint, no man is, but he was a victim of the people with whom he made enemies, namely Louis Strauss, and their conflict is accurately portrayed in Nolan's film, insofar as it adheres to Bird and Sherwin's work. Joe Cirincione is a national security analyst and arms control expert. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he now writes the Strategy and History newsletter on Substack. He has a 5-part series available now about Oppenheimer and the bomb. And when Joe's been on the show before, I've always managed to fit in some Dr. Strangelove references. Alas, we're talking about a different movie today. Joe Cirincione, welcome back.
Hey, thank you very much for having me.
What did you think of the movie?
Well, I think we have a new classic movie. It was just brilliant. It was maybe the fastest 3 hours I've ever spent in a theater. I mean, the cinematography was brilliant. The acting was Oscar award winning, and for a number of them. And the storytelling was just first rate. I really appreciate how he didn't take a linear approach, starting from the very beginning and following it year by year, but wove these three big events of Oppenheimer's life together to give you this complex picture. And he did something that's extremely hard to do. I mean, he told some deep scientific explanation of what was going on, weaving it together with the politics and the strategy, and then presenting it in the form of one person's biography. And in that way, he develops a very effective story around these very, very deep philosophical, moral, and military questions. So this is definitely a film worth seeing. You will not be bored.
It's a cinematic achievement. Christopher Nolan is a genius. And you're right, the way he chose to tell the story is important here. It wasn't just A to Z. He goes back and forth in time. He had to find a way to build in suspense because we know how the story goes, right? But the pacing of his movies, right? They're a challenge. You don't catch everything the first time you're watching it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing it again. I've been vacationing in Cape Cod this month, so I saw it on a relatively small screen. So as soon as I get back to DC, I want to catch it on a 70 millimeter IMAX screen for the whole effect.
Was it good history?
Oh, it was excellent history. I mean, I'm someone who has followed this stuff very closely over the years, and both scientifically and politically, it tracks very closely with what happened. And of course, the movie is based on American Prometheus by Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin, which I've also read over the summer. And it is a 700-page detailed history of this period, voluminously footnoted, sourced, etc. And the script tracked very closely with this. There's a couple of dramatic licenses taken in this, attributing to Einstein, for example, some things he never actually said. That dramatic moment with Einstein and Oppenheimer by the pond in Princeton, that actually never happened. Those are relatively minor and really, things for dramatic storytelling rather than, something that's essential to the historical record.
The book is superb. I don't read a lot of biography, but this biography is excellent.
It is on a number of levels, just on a personal level of who was this person, and then telling the historic drama of the period and the creation of the first atomic bomb.
Yeah, I was going to say, often people say the book is always better than the movie, but in this case, they're both excellent. And, I was actually surprised at how many anecdotes, stray bits of dialogue that are in the book make it into the movie. And, those types of things, had Nolan ignored them or taken more dramatic license with them, the average person watching would never know. That doesn't necessarily enhance the movie's historical weight, although it does make it more accurate, right? It's the big stuff that's important. The decision to drop the bomb on Hiroshima, how they came about building a bomb in the first place. So why don't we dive into those? We'll stop being film critics.
Yeah.
And because no one comes to me, maybe they come to you, but no one comes to me for my artistic criticism. Why don't we talk a little bit about then what the film does get into, but not in a way where it's boring like a physics class. And you'll be disappointed to find out, Joe, I hated physics class. In high school, my teacher was terrible. Well, he was good with physics, but he wasn't good at teaching.
At this time in history, physics was tremendously exciting. Yes. And that's one of the things that the film captures. Avalanches of discoveries were ongoing as people were coming to grips with their understanding of what the atom is. The idea of an atom had been around since the Greeks, that you could, if you cut matter into its smallest piece, eventually you'll get to a piece you cannot cut anymore. In fact, the word atom means indivisible in Greek. But what exactly this thing was unknown really until the beginning of the 20th century. And then scientific discovery started to tumble out, that it was made up of protons, that there were electrons that orbited them. And then in the 30s, the discovery of the neutron. And all this was happening during Oppenheimer's life. And he was seized with this. The film gives you that sense of dynamism in the discussions. Remember the scene of the students following him around Berkeley campus? Because all this was just cutting edge science. And then it's interrupted by the discovery of fission, which maybe you'd like to talk about. And then scientists immediately understood the military implications of that. This is all happening 1938, 1939, as Hitler is beginning his march, his invasion of Poland, and the science crashes right into military necessity. And that's why we get the Manhattan Project.
Yeah, I do want to ask you about that. But you're right. The physicists were, in their own way, a celebrity. And then Oppenheimer was interested in things outside of physics that made him a very charismatic individual. He was a brilliant theoretician, right? He often didn't follow through on some of his theories. He moved on to the next thing. But there's no question that he was a brilliant man. But the bomb, right, was the product of work of many, many scientists. And not just in the United States, in Europe as well. So why did scientists become interested in fission? I know that Enrico Fermi, an Italian like you and I, was doing experiments in the 1930s. So what brought them to the subject of fission?
Oh, they're excited about discovering the essence of nature, unlocking the secrets of matter. When you get to the smallest possible level, or so they thought, what is it? What is the foundation of our reality? So these are very profound questions. They had been experimenting with bombarding elements with neutrons for about 10 or 15 years by the time the movie picks up. And they were using this to try to transmute elements. Can you turn an element into something else? The old alchemist dream. If we can add a neutron to this atom, what exactly is the relationship of the electrons to the protons, etc.? Those are the questions they're going for. This is basic foundational experimental physics. That's what's going on. Oppenheimer's a theoretical physicist. He's doing all these equations, but these scientists are in their labs. And in the course of that, some of them are seized with uranium, which is the heaviest natural element. It doesn't get heavier than uranium, 92 protons. And so they were trying to add neutrons to that to see what would happen. And in the course of it, around 1938, late 38, early 39, two German scientists in Nazi Germany realized that what's happening is that the uranium atom is splitting, that when they do it in exactly the right way, the uranium atom will split, and it does make two other elements, usually barium and krypton, not particularly interesting. But then something else is happening. They noticed that two things happened that they didn't expect. One, that their test tubes were heating up. Well, what's causing that? And the other is that the weight of the tested elements after the experiment was less than it was before the experiment. So they realized that the heat was being caused by energy, which was being created by transmission of matter into energy, that famous Einstein formula, the only formula we all know, E equals mc squared. Matter times c, the speed of light squared, releases this enormous amount of energy. And that was the breakthrough that got everybody excited. That's the one you see in the film when a student rushes into the class and says they've discovered fission. It doesn't take Oppenheimer long, maybe a little longer than the film, but all scientists immediately realized what this meant. If you could release that much energy from one atom, how much energy could you release from trillions of atoms? And you could get the most explosive device ever created. Yeah. That is what starts to worry scientists and take them out of theoretical physics into practical strategy and politics.
There will be no test about atomic numbers at the end of this podcast. But so they're doing this because, well, this is what scientists do. And at some point, though, they start to think of practical uses for this knowledge. Not just necessarily a bomb, right?
Right. Energy. So it could be a bomb, but it could also be an enormous source of energy that could power the world.
Because you don't need to understand physics, and how many of us actually do, to understand how important it is to know about it, to understand our natural world. They were unlocking the most powerful laws in the universe. It really is incredible. I do not have that type of mind. So Oppenheimer and top physicists around the world knew as early as February 1939 that an atomic bomb was a possibility based on these fission experiments. And I'm getting this from American Prometheus by Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin. the late Martin Sherwin. Nuclear fission, as you mentioned, discovered in Germany in 1939, and that anecdote in the movie is correct. The kids in the barber shop reading about it in the newspaper. Today, you'd see it, I don't know, on Twitter. He leaps out of the barber shop carrying the newspaper to the lab, right, where he tells Oppenheimer about it.
Yeah.
What was Oppenheimer's reaction?
Well, first it was disbelief. And he didn't believe it was possible. It can't possibly be true. You can't do this. But then you work the equations and you realize it can be true. And then you flip, you accept that, and you realize the implications of it, because two key parts of it. One is that energy is produced by the splitting of the atom, but something else is going on. It took them a while to quite understand this. When you split an atom, it releases other neutrons. And that means you get not just energy, but you get other projectiles that can be used to split nearby atoms. And if those atoms of uranium can be put close enough together, you could set, for every one neutron you put in, you're going to get two on average out. Well, that can give you a chain reaction. 1 becomes 2, 4, 8. You see where this goes. And it was those two realizations, energy is produced from fission and a chain reaction could be sustainable, that made you realize this could be a real viable source of energy or explosive force. And that's what gets scientists going. It takes them a while to see, could we do this? Because the problem is not all uranium atoms undergo fission. In fact, only the isotope of uranium U-235 will reliably undergo fission. But U-235 is very rare in natural uranium. So for every 100 parts of uranium you have, only 7 of those parts will be uranium-235. How do you get uranium to be purified so you have more of that isotope? That is not a scientific challenge. Well, it is, but it's more of an engineering challenge. You've got to enrich uranium-235. And many, many people for 1939, 1940 didn't think it was possible to do that. And that was going to stop this from becoming a practical source of energy or a weapon.
Just to remind people of the timeline, Hitler comes to power in 1933. The invasion of Poland is 6 years later, 1939. We mentioned how nuclear fission is discovered in Germany in 1939. But it wasn't until the spring of 1941 that a pair, and you've written about this in your Substack, a pair of German scientists who are in England, they left Nazi Germany, they figure out how a usable atomic bomb can be produced quickly in time for use during the war. Talk about the significance of this.
Well, Hitler had two things going against him in this, because, the scientific knowledge, and the film talks about this and the book talks about this, there was no secret to the atomic bomb. There was no secret to fission. This was being spread all around the world. So the Japanese understood this, the Germans, the English, the French, the Russians, everybody understood the science. The science doesn't really start to clamp down until the government enters the pictures in like 1941, and then research papers on this stuff are suppressed, so not shared. The problem was always the engineering. Could you do this? And for Hitler, he wanted to concentrate his economic resources on other, as you mentioned, tanks. In fact, in the final days of the war, he was more concerned with developing a jet engine than he was a nuclear bomb. But he was also handicapped by his prejudice. He thought nuclear physics was Jewish science. That's what he called it, Jewish science. And he expelled many of the finest physicists in his country because they were Jewish, including Fritsch and Pearl. And that's how they end up in England. And that's how they figure out by 1941 that there was a way to purify uranium. And you could do this by something they called gaseous diffusion. And this was the method that we used during the war. This is what we ended up building in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Basically, you turn uranium into a gas. You combine it with fluoride, and then you run it through a series of filters so that the bigger U-238 atoms are left behind, and the slightly smaller U-235 atoms get through the filters. And you do that over and over and over again, and you end up with a gas that has a lot more U-235 atoms in it, and then you've got the concentration you need for a chain reaction. But to do that, we built, and this is the great American strength you're referring to, we built the equivalent of the American automobile industry to produce one product.
Amazing.
Refined enriched uranium. The plant at Oak Ridge was in a U shape. Each leg of the plant was a half mile long. That's how big it took. That's how much industrial might it took to create the tiny amounts of uranium that end up being delivered to Los Alamos in 1945.
Yeah, the United States was the only nation with those types of resources. Unlocked by the war, of course, we had been in a depression that was not abating by the 1940-41 period. In fact, after some uptick in the U.S. economy in FDR's first term, things got pretty bad in the second term again. The U.S. was the only nation with the industrial might to pull something like this off. But at the time, it was not clear that Germany wasn't going to be able to do this. On the contrary, Oppenheimer and others are worried that Germany's going to get the bomb first. And that seems to be what the impetus was for the U.S. to go ahead and do this, because these scientists were ambivalent about using this power to build a bomb. But Oppenheimer believed they had to do it before the Germans got it, right?
Yeah. So this is the movie in many ways shortchanges this actual episode, but it's very important. The impetus to build the bomb didn't come from the military. It came from the scientists. It wasn't defense contractors who were coming to the government saying, do this. It was Leo Szilard. It was Eugene Wigner. It was Albert Einstein, who joins with these two and others in 1939 to write a letter to Roosevelt saying, look, we think Hitler is building a bomb, and we don't mean any bomb. And they explain in this letter that the discovery of fission has meant that we could probably build a bomb of a new type, as they say. And one small bomb containing just hundreds of pounds of explosive could destroy a city or a port. And they believe that Hitler is marching to do this. That's what motivates them. He had invaded Poland. He had taken over Czechoslovakia. He had stopped the export of uranium from the Czechoslovakian mines. He was concentrating scientific talent under Werner Heisenberg in Berlin. They worried that he was doing it. And they said in the letter, if he gets this, there is no defense to this weapon. You cannot militarily counter it. The only way we can do it is to build a weapon of our own to deter Hitler from using it. Now, they and Fritz Perls and other scientists who were then writing in 39, 40 about the bomb 41 to their respective governments in the UK and America, they never thought we would use the bomb. They considered this an inhuman device because obviously a bomb this size is going to kill tens of thousands of innocent civilians. What moral government would do that? They wanted it for a deterrent. That's why they all joined in on it. And their efforts paid off. By 41, they had finally convinced both the British and the American government to devote serious resources to this. And that's when the Manhattan Project begins. And that's when you see General Leslie Groves, who had just proved his engineering chops by building the Pentagon, the largest office building in the world. And they put him in charge of the Manhattan Project. He recruits Oppenheimer, and they together, as the movie shows, recruits the finest physicists in America to come spend 2 years of their lives in a remote desert of New Mexico.
Played by Matt Damon, General Groves.
Yeah, great job.
Yeah, Groves, though, was a really tall and really fat fella.
He was not as good looking as Matt Damon, that's for sure.
That's okay. Those types of inaccuracies, if you will, aren't that important. Although the main actor, he does look like Oppenheimer, who, by the way, was really thin, rail thin, smoked 4 to 5 packs of cigarettes a day, and had a terrible persistent cough. The cough doesn't really appear in the movie. I guess that probably would have made the movie difficult to watch if Oppenheimer's coughing all the time. But we can get back to the decision about the bomb. One wonders, had it not been for the accurate belief that Germany was trying to do this, at least at first, before Germany gives up on it. As we mentioned, only the U.S. had the capability of doing this. Had it not been for that belief, you wonder if these scientists would have pushed to build a bomb with nuclear fission.
We actually have a record on that. Einstein says this is the only mistake he ever made in his life. And he says in a famous interview in 1954 that had he known that Germany was not pursuing this bomb, he never would have written the letter. And it's quite possible we never would have had a Manhattan Project. It's quite possible we never would have had an atomic bomb because of the resource question. It isn't that people didn't know you could do it. It's that it required so much money. It's the equivalent of $38 billion in today's dollars. The Manhattan Project cost $2 billion in then-year dollars. but almost 40 billion in our year dollars. That's a lot of money to be devoting to a physics experiment. It's possible we could have had a completely different non-atomic future.
The movie and the book, I believe, are accurate as they portray Oppenheimer as privately or personally ambivalent about all of this. However, as an administrator of the Manhattan Project, he doesn't give much thought, again, as he's consumed with administrative tasks and trying to bring this project to the fastest possible completion. He's not thinking too much about the long-term implications of atomic weaponry until he gets a visit from Niels Bohr,
yes,
the great physicist who had escaped Europe, which was under Nazi occupation, makes his way to Los Alamos. And he's a visionary. What was Bohr's vision, and how did that influence Oppenheimer?
Well, Bohr was not involved in the stress or the project, the necessity of producing these bombs as quickly as possible. He was reflecting on what it would all mean after the war. And there were others like this, but Bohr was the leader, saying, well, what does it mean if we give fallible human beings the ability to destroy tens, hundreds of thousands of their fellow human beings in an instance? What kind of world is that going to be? Understanding that once you create this, you can't uncreate it. Bohr's answer was an open society, meaning that you have to let other countries know what you're doing, particularly in this case, the Soviet Union. So he says you have to let our ally, remember, the Soviets are doing the bulk of the fighting in Europe. Their soldiers are dying by the thousands every day. He says you have to let the Soviets know we're doing this so they will not be suspicious that we're doing this in some way to gain an edge on them. And after the war, you have to share the knowledge of atomic technology so that people can enjoy the peaceful benefits of it and be aware of what other people are doing. Are you going to build one bomb, two bombs, three bombs? This kind of open society approach is a theme that originated really with Bohr, but then spreads, and you see many of this kind of thinking in the immediate aftermath of the war, particularly in the new United Nations.
And during the war, Oppenheimer and others are suggesting, recommending, urging the military leadership in the United States to let the Russians know. Now, the Soviet Union was finding out about this because they had two spies in the Manhattan Project. For all the surveillance Groves and his people placed on the people who were in Los Alamos, they missed the two spies, at least at first. Of course, one of those spies wasn't even recruited. He just went ahead and shared the secrets with the Soviets.
Right.
But anyway, maybe we'll return to the surveillance issue in a bit. During the war, Oppenheimer and others are saying, let's tell the Soviets, let's bring them in. They're our allies. They're destroying the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. They're losing millions of people. Let them know. Before the test, there's even a suggestion of allowing the Japanese to come see it too, to scare the hell out of them. So, yeah, we already see this at the time. Why should we keep this a secret? But, Joe Cirincione, Oppenheimer is also telling his people, we are not policymakers. We are not here to tell the government how, when, and where to use this gadget, as they called it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think he's correct about that. I mean, they didn't have all the information. Their job is not to be figuring out the geopolitical complications of all this. They're focused on building the bomb itself. I believe he's right about that. Afterwards, after the war, and we see some of this in the last hour of the film, Oppenheimer shows great anguish about his decision, but he didn't have that anguish while he was doing it.
Oppenheimer was one of 4 scientists who went and sat down with the very blandly named Interim Committee that was chaired by the Secretary of War, Stimson. And some of these scientists wanted Oppenheimer to bring these moral objections up during these interim committee meetings where, let's be honest, there really wasn't a debate about if the bomb should be used. The decision was set in motion. Events took over. But when Germany surrenders, right, Hitler shoots himself in the bunker, scientists start gathering together, holding meetings in meeting halls, talking about, let's not drop this on Japan. We don't have to drop this on Japan. But, that never really made it to the level of Truman and the others.
Because remember, the scientists began this project because they feared that Germany was going to get it. And if Nazi Germany got this bomb first, they would be unstoppable. That's why you see Groves saying this is the most important thing that has ever happened in the history of the world. This project, we have to stop Hitler. Well, we did stop Hitler. He didn't have the bomb. Japan did not have a coherent bomb program. Japan was being defeated. So now what's the purpose of dropping this weapon? And by this time, remember, we had gotten over the moral abhorrence of killing large numbers of innocent civilians. We had been firebombing Dresden and Hamburg. By the time we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, Curtis LeMay had conducted 60 or more firebombing raids and decimating almost every city in Tokyo. In fact, they had trouble finding cities in Japan that could be targeted with the atomic bomb that had not been hit, not been destroyed. They wanted a pure test. The fire raids in Japan had killed 1 million Japanese, incinerated by our bombs. So the moral barrier to doing it for many was just, well, this is just a more efficient bomb. We're just going to do what we've already been doing. And remember, this was all being controlled by the military. The military is making the decision. So now they have this bomb. They want to use it. They're also interested in knowing what it can do. They're also interested in sending a signal to the Russians, who they already see as their post-war rival. So there's a whole lot of reasons to do it, as well as the possibility, exaggerated by some, but the possibility that Japan would keep fighting and we might have to have an invasion, which would kill hundreds of thousands of Americans in the invasion attempt. So all of that leads inexorably to the dropping of the bomb. And while this is happening, the scientists saying, wait, we don't have to do this. Committees are formed in the Chicago lab that have been producing the material, writing a report saying, don't drop the bomb, do a demonstration shot. It's considered very briefly by the government, but rejected. Yeah. Even Oppenheimer in the movie says they won't believe it until they see it, and they won't see it unless we use it on a city. So that logic prevails. There's never a serious thought to not using it at the highest levels of U.S. government.
They won't fear it until they understand it. And they won't understand it until they've used it.
Atomic weaponry is different. And maybe it sounds like an obvious question, what's the difference? But firebombing, as horrible as it is, and it was horrible, 100,000 in Tokyo dead, large sections of the city burned down. The atomic bomb was different.
Oh, it absolutely was different. It's instead of hundreds of bombers going over a city, it was one plane, one bomb, 70,000 people dead. I mean, we had never seen anything like that in the millennia of human warfare. This was mass destruction on a scale that nobody believed possible. And we made it technologically easy to do.
And the after effects, right? I mean, they were aware that the radiation would linger and make places of the world possibly uninhabitable, right?
Early on, and you see this in the early memos, the radiation will be in effect on here and will carry for miles and it will last for days or week at the site. But still, scientists didn't understand how much radiation was going to be produced, what it meant that a mushroom cloud would put this into the higher atmosphere and carry it for hundreds, even thousands of miles. So they really didn't understand that the Trinity test itself would irradiate thousands of people who were living in New Mexico. Generations later, they're still suffering from genetic mutations, cancer-causing mutations, with the result of this site. Wow. They didn't understand how Japanese would survive the initial blast and appear to be fine, and then a week later drop dead from radiation poisoning. All that became clear after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And of course, these kinds of issues become even more important when you get to the development of the H-bomb, the hydrogen bomb, which forms the last third of this movie. And this is what produces Oppenheimer's clash with Louis Strauss, the head of the Atomic Energy Commission, because he, with scientist Edward Teller, were convinced we had to develop a bigger bomb. And for Oppenheimer and many other scientists, this was another moral Rubicon, one they did not want to cross.
In my next episode, I'm going to return to the decision. Well, it really wasn't a decision, but we'll get into that. Next episode with David M. Kennedy, talk about the end of World War II. But I appreciate hearing your insights about that, Joe. One more remark about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Reading from American Prometheus, more than 95% of the roughly 225,000 people killed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were civilians, mostly women and children. Half the victims died of radiation poisoning in the months following the initial blast. I mean, it does become clear pretty quickly that we're in a new era now.
Right. Because if you can produce one bomb, you can produce 10, 100, 1,000, which in fact is what we do. You know, originally after the end of the war, the Air Force thought we wouldn't need more than 60 of these devices, because after that, you kind of run out of targets, they said.
But Joe Cirincione, your deterrence needs credibility.
There were those kinds of arguments that did in fact occur. And we ended up producing nuclear weapons in the 50s for all kinds of things: artillery shells, landmines, short-range rockets, long-range rockets, airdrop munitions, infantry-fired weapons. We ended up producing 20,000 nuclear weapons in the 1950s. I think in some ways scientists might have underestimated how nuclear nuts we were going to become, but they understood the terror. Einstein writes in 1954 that the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union has assumed hysterical proportions. And they do believe that this is going to lead to the end of humanity. You know, many of the scientists, and Oppenheimer among them, felt deep moral responsibility for this, that they started with the best of intentions. They started to stop a world-threatening evil, but in the process, they may have created a world-destroying evil. And that's the dilemma they lived with for the rest of their lives.
The perverse logic of MAD, mutually assured destruction, right? It has no end. You keep going and going and going because you can never have enough missiles, just because in the event your opponent knocks out most of your weapons, you still have enough to, catch them with their pants down or whatever. Not to get back into Dr. Strangelove, because we're talking about Oppenheimer here. But, the other side of that argument, I'm not sure I agree with it, is MAD prevented war between superpowers. It placed a check on conventional wars getting out of control. So, we do have Korea, where MacArthur wanted to drop nuclear weapons and Truman got rid of him. Vietnam never escalated to nuclear war. I don't know. How do you feel about that argument in the nuclear age that this actually prevented major wars?
Well, I think it's overstated.
Yeah.
There's no question that nuclear weapons have a deterrent effect. There's no question that the possibility that a conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States would lead to an atomic exchange, stayed the hands of leaders in both those countries on many occasions. But that generally ignores the other factors that were at play in this period. We, the United States, led the way in creating new economic and diplomatic and political institutions that also deterred war, whether you're talking about the World Bank or NATO or the European Union, where economic and political ties made it unthinkable that France and Germany would go to war, even though that's exactly what France and Germany had done every generation since before there was a France and Germany, when it was just Franks and Goths. Well, now they don't do it anymore, but it's not because of nuclear weapons. It's because of these other political, diplomatic, and economic ties. And this one final factor, the problem with thinking that nuclear deterrence is a good thing is that it's true, it deters war, but if nuclear deterrence fails, it fails catastrophically. And we have come very close over the last 8 decades to having this fail and stumbling into a nuclear war by accident, by miscalculation, or in some cases by madness.
I've been talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis on the show recently. Yeah. Also, too, it's a matter of national priorities, our resources, our energies, the amount of money. And, Eisenhower, who, of course, oversaw the dramatic expansion of our nuclear arsenal, because that's what he preferred to having a large standing army and sending the army all over the planet, right? A nuclear deterrence was maybe, in his view, the better option or the cheaper option. He warned us about this in his farewell address, as I mentioned, after building up our nuclear forces, of the military-industrial complex.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals.
And you see these debates now. We're currently in a debate about whether the answer to the nuclear competition that exists between the United States and Russia, the United States and China, other countries, there are 9 nuclear-armed countries, how to address this competition. Those on my side of the equation talk about reducing the number of weapons. We still embrace the Niels Bohr concept of openness. We should have transparent arsenals. We should reveal exactly how many weapons we have, the Russians, et cetera, the Chinese, et cetera. We should be engaging in talks to reduce these other confidence-building measures. That's the way to solve the problem. And this is exactly what scientists said back in 44, in 45, in the early days of the nuclear age, that there is no military way to secure yourself from these weapons. The only hope lies in negotiations, lies in diplomatic ways to prevent the conflict from happening in the first place. And on the other side, you see voices saying, in your best Dr. Strangelove voice, that we need more of these weapons, that the way to win is by nuclear dominance, that we have to intimidate the other side, convince them that they can't possibly win in exchange. So I just read an article 2 days ago saying that the United States has to redouble its efforts to build more and more nuclear weapons, ignoring the fact that we are already building an entire new generation of bombers and subs and missiles that's going to cost us about $75 billion a year over the next 10 years. $75 billion a year, bigger than the budget of most government departments, just on new nuclear weapons. As the scientists back then would say, and still say now, this way lies madness.
$75 billion is more than most countries spend on their entire defense.
Absolutely.
It is madness. But if anything, Joe, maybe Oppenheimer, the movie, will get people thinking about this again, because something that has happened in recent years, and we've discussed this in the couple of times you've been on the show in the past. Our most recent conversation, that podcast episode is titled Star Wars, because of the anniversary of Reagan's SDI initiative, is that cultural awareness has faded in recent decades. The golden age of arms-controlled treaties is in the past. And so maybe Oppenheimer will renew it. It can't just be one movie. But there used to be so many movies and books written about this type of thing.
Yes. I think this film has already stimulated hundreds of discussions about this, and it's only been out for 2 weeks. It's a huge box office success, so this movie's going to have legs, and we're going to be dealing with it for the next couple of years as it goes to streaming services, etc. It captures the story so brilliantly. I know some people have complained about it, understandably, because it leaves out, for example, the radiation effects from the Trinity test. It doesn't really show the Japanese dying and suffering from the bomb.
Right. They're invisible. The Japanese are invisible in the movie. That's one of my critiques. But go ahead. Yeah.
An understandable criticism of this. It doesn't really go enough into the Oppenheimer's resistance to the H-bomb. He and the entire scientific community advising Lewis Strauss voted against developing the H-bomb. They called it a weapon of genocide. You know, they could have done more of that, but it does so much, and it does it so well. It reignites interest in this. And so I have to think that there are going to be other shows, stories, books going into some of these deeper aspects of it, going into this very interesting, intellectually, dramatically historical period of the beginning of the atomic age and the kinds of decisions we made, even going into Eisenhower's anguishing about this. He didn't think we should have nuclear weapons, and yet he presided over the construction of 20,000 of them. What was going on with Eisenhower? Where was his conflicts on this? The forces that made him do something he really didn't think we should be doing. There's a whole lot of great drama yet to be unpackaged from the beginning of the nuclear age.
And in the summer of 45, Eisenhower questioned why would we drop the bomb on the Japanese when they were defeated.
Exactly. Yeah, that's an American Prometheus, not in the movie. He opposed it. He thought it was crazy to do this. And you hear Oppenheimer later talking about how we dropped the bomb on essentially a defeated enemy.
The pattern of the use of atomic weapons was set at Hiroshima. They are weapons of aggression, of surprise, and of terror. If they are ever used again, it may well be by the thousands, or perhaps by the tens of thousands. Their method of delivery may well be different, and may reflect new possibilities of interception and new efforts to outwit them. And the strategy of their use may well be different than it was against an essentially defeated enemy.
But before a bomb could be dropped on Japan, it had to be tested successfully in the deserts of New Mexico. And the best part, or the most memorable part of the movie, was the Trinity test. And something I did not realize, Joe, there was a concern, tiny possibility, but a concern nonetheless, that the bomb would trigger a chain reaction that would never stop and light the Earth's atmosphere on fire.
Yes, this was Teller's calculations, actually, and it was to stem from his interest in the H-bomb. Here's just a real quick little science lesson. You know, the H-bomb is powered by nuclear fusion, which is what powers the sun and all stars. And it's not the splitting of atoms, but it's the forcing of atoms together. So in the sun, the pressure of the gravity forces hydrogen atoms to fuse together. And when they do, they produce helium atoms and release an enormous amount of energy, much more than from the fission process. Teller realized that if you could build a fission device, well, now you could recreate the conditions inside the sun, and you could use that fission, that atomic bomb, that heat, pressure, and radiation to fuse hydrogen atoms together, which of course we eventually do. The hydrogen bomb does exactly that. And he was calculating that it might be that the setting off of the atomic fission bomb would start to fuse hydrogen atoms, which exist naturally in the air. And if you do that, that might set off an uncontrolled fusion reaction that you couldn't stop, igniting the atmosphere, destroying the Earth. And in that famous scene, you know, they eventually disprove this. This is where Oppenheimer brings the calculations to Einstein. And that doesn't actually happen, as far as I know. And they figure it out that, no, the calculations are off. You won't most likely get this reaction. And that's what Oppenheimer's telling Groves. That, well, there's a small chance, but, you know, it's negligible. And goes, almost zero?
Yeah, that's right. It wasn't zero, but it was almost zero.
Are we saying there's a chance that when we push that button, we destroy the world?
Chances are near zero.
Near zero.
What do you want for theory alone?
Zero would be nice.
So, Joe, you'll recall in the movie that after the bomb is dropped, Oppenheimer goes to address his staff in a gymnasium or an auditorium to tell them that the project's been a success. And that's when you see his ambivalence, the way it's portrayed in the movie, flashes of fire and destruction, you know, crossing his imagination, his mind's eye. So when it comes to his legacy, what did he accomplish? Can we call this an achievement? Scientifically, for sure. But you know, I've been grappling with this since I watched the movie, and this has been your career, you know, nuclear arms and arms control. I mean, how do you assess a legacy like this?
I think you still have to say that he was one of the greatest scientists of the 20th century and did a great service to the nation in leading the Manhattan Project. For all the moral dilemmas and for the horror of the dropping of the bomb, which I do not think we should have done. I would have been with those scientists writing the Frank report in June of 45, arguing that the United States should not do this. They were right to begin the project and to see it through. The problem is that they grossly underestimated their ability to influence government policy with the weapon once they had created it. And the movie sort of captures this beautifully when you see the scientists watching as their bombs that they had created at Los Alamos are packed up and put on trucks and leave their scientific compound. It sort of epitomizes that the military is taking over from here. Thank you very much. We don't need you guys anymore. The scientists had answers to this. The politicians in the Baruch report, the Lilienthal report in 45 and 46, where they urged international control of the bomb. Truman introduces the first UN resolution to the new United Nations saying we should disarm. There should not be any atomic bombs. And we'll take the few we have and turn them over to international control. Those are actually the answers. The problem is that the global dynamics prevented us from accepting those answers, but it's still the things we wrestle with today. And in that regard, I think Oppenheimer's legacy, particularly his eloquent opposition to the hydrogen bomb, could serve us well. It'd be well worth our time to go not just see this movie, not just read this book, but to further explore those early ideas of scientists and realize that there is a way to live with the knowledge that we can create nuclear weapons without actually creating those nuclear weapons, and certainly not having them in the numbers that we have now, many under hair trigger alert, waiting for the press of a button.
Atomic weapons are based on things that are in the very frontier of physics. Their development is inextricably entangled with the growth of physics, as in all probability with that of the biological sciences and many practical arts. Atomic weapons were actually made by scientists, even some of you may think by scientists normally committed to the exploration of rather recondite things. The speed of the development, the active and essential participation of men of science in the development, have no doubt contributed greatly to our awareness of the crisis that faces us, even to our sense of responsibility for its resolution. But these are contingent things. What is not contingent is that we have made a thing, a most terrible weapon, that has altered abruptly and profoundly the nature of the world.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, we'll dive deeper into the decision to drop the bomb on Hiroshima, then Nagasaki in August 1945. Was it necessary, and what was Oppenheimer's role? That's next when David M. Kennedy joins us as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.